Hey, this is Blondeguygamer, and welcome to another They Made a Sequel. Although admittedly this one is a bit of a stretch as an actual sequel, but I figured it would still evoke the question for anyone that first see this, or at least go, they made it too? So I think it still counts. Plus, it gave me an excuse to play what is arguably the most recognizable game ever made, Tetris. I don't think I need to explain to anyone watching what Tetris is, but I can explain how it all came about. Created by Alexei Pajitnov in 1984, the game started out as something he made on an Electronica 60 computer while working at the Dornitsyn Computing Center of the Academy of Sciences in Moscow, Russia. Inspired by pentomino puzzle sets, he set out to make a version of it on his work computer. Due to it being too complex with pentomino shapes, he scaled the pieces down to 4-block tetrominos that could be rotated while dropping down, and having full horizontal lines cleared from the board instead of simply filling up to keep the game going as long as you can, adding the oh-so-addictive endless nature the game is known for. It got its name by combining the words Tetra with Alexei's favorite sport, tennis, becoming Tetris. And after having Dmitry Polovsky and Vadim Gerasimov port the game to IBM PCs, it quickly started to spread, eventually leading to Microsoft and Spectrum Holobyte releasing an IBM PC version outside of Russia, and Hank Rogers of Bulletproof Software securing the console and handheld rights for Nintendo, which that in of itself was quite an ordeal to settle on, so much so that a movie was made about it a couple years ago. The game, of course, became a worldwide hit, with the Game Boy version as a North American and European system launch title that ended up selling 35 million copies. And my cartridge is one of them, being among the first video games I've ever played, likely after Super Mario Land, as that has my earliest gaming memories. And since then there have been a lot of versions of Tetris made, from the NES, after the Tetris version got pulled anyway, to subsequent releases on following generations of platforms, variations that mix things up like Tetrisphere, which, by the way, great soundtrack, and this should get on the N64 Switch games already, to more modern iterations like Tetris Effect and Tetris 99, and most recently last year with Tetris Forever to celebrate and showcase 40 years of the game's creation. But those don't compare to what is my magnum opus in my Tetris collection. You think the music in Tetris Effect is good? Well, wait till you hear CDI Tetris! The point is that there are a lot of Tetris games. That was only scratching the surface. So the question I posed for this was, what is the actual first sequel to Tetris? And well, you would think that the game that's literally called Tetris 2 would be that, but it's not as simple as that. Because in Japan, this is actually Tetris Flash, and that Tetris 2 was already on the Famicom in 1991 by Chunsoft. Though this is more or less an improved version of the first Famicom Tetris game, as this has controls you would expect versus ones that'll make you go, really Hank? This is what you and Bulletproof settled on at first? Okay, this was before the Game Boy version, so those standards of controls hadn't been figured out yet. And I guess they were trying to replicate the computer version's controls on a Famicom controller, but still, take the advice to change the controls if you play on Tetris Forever, trust me. Famicom Tetris 2 also includes the A and B game types of Game Boy and NES Tetris, along with the new C-type, where you deal with rising garbage blocks. And on top of that was an additional game mode called Bomb Bliss, a variation of Tetris where you blow up bombs with lines to clear stages. And that became a sub-series of Tetris, usually bundled together with a new version of Tetris like this one, which, before Tetris Forever, we would only get the Game Boy Super Bomb Bliss as Tetris Blast, another childhood Game Boy game of mine. Also, fun fact, Bomb Bliss was designed by Akihito Miura, who would later be a part of and was the designer for Mother 2, or Earthbound as we know it. And that's not all, Tsunekazu Ishihara was the producer, who was also a producer for Earthbound while at Ape, and is now the president of the Pokemon Company. And if that somehow wasn't enough, the director of the first few Dragon Quest games, creator of Xevious, and the composer of Dragon Quest also worked on this. I guess you could say all of them working on this had a Tetris effect that connected all of them together. Okay, that was bad even for my standards. While Miura and Ishihara did start this as one of the ideas for a follow-up or sequel to Tetris that was presented to Alexei Pajitnov, Bomb Bliss is more of its own variation, and the Tetris part is really just an updated version of Tetris for Famicom players since they didn't get our NES version. So I wouldn't say it's a sequel in the traditional sense. But I guess that does bring up the question, how do you even make a sequel to something like Tetris, where the core gameplay just works so well as it is that you really don't need to change it much other than maybe updating it a little every time you re-release it. Change things too much and it'll likely be considered more of a spin-off. What counts as a meaningful sequel in that sense? It's a question that the people involved with making and bringing Tetris to the world likely did struggle when coming up with what to follow that up, but it's not like they didn't try. The next game that Pajitnov worked on was Weltris, designing it along with Andrea Snegoff, which was released 2 years before Tetris 2 plus Bomb Bliss for MS-DOS. In this game, we're sending pieces down the well. Along 4 sides to clear lines in the middle square, or bottom, of the well. If a piece ends up sticking into a wall, that gets locked off until you can clear it, with the game ending once all 4 areas are locked out. It's an interesting pseudo 3D take on Tetris, but not something I would really play for long periods. Now this is technically the first sequel to Tetris, and by the original Tetris creator no less, so why am I not reviewing this one? Well, no pun intended, it's because there isn't much else to talk about. The video would just be the Tetris history and talk about the game for a minute or two with one Simpsons joke. That's it. Even then, I would say this is more of another variation than a sequel. It also doesn't help that Tetris came out the very same year as the Game Boy and NES Tetris, which were a lot of people's first foray into Tetris. And this only got ported to arcade, Mac, and other 8-bit and 16-bit home computers, so unless you were really into Tetris on PC back then, you may not even know about this game until it's mentioned in post-launch inclusion in Tetris Forever, like I did. So it's not a super well-known sequel, let alone entry, in the franchise. Which, granted, is the point of they made a sequel, but I still have my limits. Heck, more people probably know about Hatris more than Weltris, which was also designed by Alexei Pajitnov, this time along with Vladimir Porkilko, and it did get released on Game Boy and NES over here in 1991 and 2 respectively, so it is in a way a follow-up of Tetris for those systems. Though I'd argue it's not quite a Tetris game, even though it technically is, it's in Tetris Forever, I guess because it still has Tris in the title, but in that sense it feels more like a spiritual successor to me, like Bioshock after System Shock. This one's a bit out there, but still kind of fun. Either way, still not the sequel I'm looking for, and the only other Tetris game that Pajitnov directly created was Faces Tris 3 with Porkilko on PC in 1991, which, yeah, he said he didn't really like the end result much, and you can probably see why. Spectrum Holobyte really was willing to just do whatever with the series, huh? Though that's not to say Tetris on PC wasn't successful, the original IBM Tetris did well enough to warrant a sequel of sorts called Super Tetris by Spectrum Holobyte in 1991. In that, you have to clear out lines in a rubble pit to reveal a picture and complete the stage. You also get bombs to destroy blocks, and tile power-ups called treasures that do various things to the pieces and board. It's a little weird, but distinct enough. Though again, it's another kind of obscure Tetris sequel that also became a post-launch inclusion in Tetris Forever, so not much else to say here either. Point is, while the PC version of Tetris did sell over 100,000 copies in its first year and eventually 1 million by 1995, it's still not nearly as much as the Game Boy or even the 8 million of the NES version, so it shouldn't be a surprise that the next Tetris for those markets would be branded as the sequel, and that indeed was the decision Nintendo made when bringing Tetris Flash overseas. Sure, they basically pulled another Super Mario Bros. 2 Doki Doki Panic on us, but I can't say I blame Nintendo. Given this press release, they really did point out how well Tetris did and that Tetris 2 is coming to capitalize on that. And I'd like to imagine the reveal of a Tetris 2 would go something like this.
Tetris 2!
And with that, let's, actually talk about Tetris 2 finally. I didn't think I'd have down a rabbit hole this deep for a They Made a Sequel on Tetris of all things, but that's what happens when you research into this and question what the definition of a sequel even is. And I haven't even gotten to the unofficial Tetris 2s like the one for the ZX Spectrum by Fuchsoft. No, I need to stop going even deeper. Let's just get to Tetris 2 and see how this Schrodinger's cat of a sequel and not a sequel even plays. Told you it wouldn't be simple. Tetris Flash was released on the Famicom in 1993, and on the following month for the NES as Tetris 2 in North America, while Europe got it sometime that year later. The exact dates for some game releases back then are not always kept track very well. This is also a pretty late NES release, not Star Tropics 2 or Warrior Woods 94 late, but still pretty late. Nintendo still had the console rights to Tetris around then, so naturally they're the publishers, even with the late Gunpei Yokoi being a producer. However, the developers for Tetris Flash was actually Tosei, a developer that's worked on a lot of games throughout the years and are still around, with Tales of Grace's F Remastered being their most recent game. Though most of you probably wouldn't know that because they're known for rarely crediting themselves in games they're involved in aside from the legendary Starfy games, and Tetris 2 is no exception. But it is still pretty surprising to know that this infamous Ghost developer did work on a Tetris game, aside from a later THQ Tetris DS game that got cancelled in favor of Nintendo's. Going into Tetris 2, you have the main game mode where you can adjust the speed, what round to start on up to 30, and music to play. Though picking from a music selection is the only real similarity to the original Tetris, as you'll notice this doesn't quite play like that when it starts. because instead of clearing horizontal lines like in practically every Tetris, you're dropping multicolored tetrominoes and matching 3 or more blocks of the same color clears them out, with the goal being to clear out all the dotted blocks to complete a round. So this would already throw you off if you were expecting something like the original Tetris. Instead, we have kind of a hybrid of Tetris and Dr. Mario, which is funny to think about when there was a Tetris and Dr. Mario bundle game for the Super Nintendo, though I'd say this leans more into Dr. Mario, with matching 3 colors of pills with the viruses in that. Only instead of pills, we have tetrominoes, and even those differ a little, as there can be disjoint shapes in the mix that can have parts of it placed while you move the rest elsewhere. And unlike in regular Tetris, those and any other separated blocks drop completely down, and that can actually lead to some matching combos if pulled off right, which admittedly can get pretty satisfying. What's also satisfying is that you actually don't need to clear every single dot block, as there are flashing dotted blocks of each color every round, and if you clear that before the others, all the dotted blocks of their color will also get cleared. So it's best to go for those first, as they are the actual ones you need to clear to win the round. That is, if you can, as it is easy to misplace pieces and it won't take long to get a jumbled mess of blocks that's not as easy to get rid of like in traditional Tetris. At least for someone like me that knows how to get out of a bind in those, which in Tetris 99, I definitely quickly learned how to. In Tetris 2, it especially gets troublesome in later rounds with faster drop speeds, that also increases the longer you play a round, and the height of blocks at the start. Though that isn't the control's fault, I don't really have any complaints there, it's just a difficulty thing. One thing that can help are solid color line pieces where if you match 6 blocks of a color, all those color blocks will get cleared, which is a good way to get out of a messily filled board. Only problem is that these take a while to show up, so you need to hold out until they do, which is easier said than done in the late game stages. Not to mention there are 80 rounds of this, which is a bit much. And while there are infinite continues, there's no save or password system, and 30 is the highest you can start with. So getting through these in one go took longer than I liked, especially later on when I kept losing and retrying rounds over and over. But what do you get for actually doing all of these? Well, every 10th round you clear, you get a part of a cutscene that involves a meteor crashing to Earth, which a guy finds and throws it back into the sky, revealing that it was a Tetris piece with the Tetris 2 title. Then it loops again, only this time it's a dinosaur guy finding the Tetris meteor, and at the end of that, we get a The End added. It is a pretty typical ending for an NES game of this nature, but it's still not really worth to go through all 80 rounds for in my opinion. 40 is where it probably should have stopped. Because by the time you get to the 30th round, the amount of blocks are so high you have little room and time to make your way through all of it. And going through another 50 rounds of this, even with my, shall we say, modern convenience to get through these faster,
that's right, we're gonna cheat,
was still pretty tedious. I won't say the game itself is bad, just that there are way too many rounds and the difficulty quickly plateaus into something that's not fun after a while. Admittedly, I will say I'm not that good at this. I haven't played Dr. Mario nearly as much as Tetris, and the constant restarting of rounds that were easy to lose right away didn't help. What also didn't help was that you were stuck with whatever music you chose until you start another game. The music itself is actually not bad. Most of it is maybe a little jaunty, circus-y, but nothing bad for NES standards. My favorite is probably the main game C track. It has a nice mellow tune to it. The music just has the unfortunate problem of not having the iconic Russian folk song remixes that the original Tetris is widely known for, which I know isn't fair, but it's hard to come even close to that. And when you're stuck with a song for the entire 80 rounds, it gets weary after a while since there's short loops that don't work as well as the main Tetris themes. Thankfully, you don't have to just do the main game mode, as this does have multiplayer, which is something the NES Tetris didn't have, as that was scrapped during its development. And you can actually play against a computer opponent, so you don't even need a second player for this. There are 3 difficulties to pick for the CPU, with 15 round layouts to choose from, along with a different selection of music just for the multiplayer, which does help to make the overall game soundtrack not as lackluster. The goal is to defeat your opponent in a first of 3 wins match. You can win by either clearing your board first, or have the opponent lose if they reach the top of their playing field. By scoring combos, you can disrupt the other players by giving them effects like having pieces fall faster or changing their next piece, all the while lowering their playing field to try and take them out that way. It does work pretty well as a competitive puzzle game, and it is nice to have a 2-player option. The only problem is that the CPU is pretty relentless on higher difficulties. On easy, it was as expected and I won there without much problems. But on just normal, I could not keep up as they were quite fast to clear blocks and send stuff my way, which further cemented that I am not very good at this game. I did manage to beat normal, but barely after several tries. And hard is, well, even harder naturally, so no way I can get good enough to defeat that. And honestly, even if I did get better at this game, it probably wouldn't change much on how I feel about it. And there isn't much going on in the visuals to change that either. Functionally, it's fine. The 3 different colors stand out enough. It's just that aside from the cutscene animations, it's pretty bare bones. Made even worse for international releases when Tetris Flash had this nice looking title screen, while we get bricks. Other than that, there are background cave drawings, crop circles that do change every 10 rounds, but the color never changes, so you'll likely be too focused on the playing field to even notice that at first. And even then it only changes twice, meaning it stays on that third one for the rest of the rounds. Why did they stop there or even bother with just 3 to begin with? Then again, I kinda wish the rounds would have stopped around there as well, which I am gonna stop here with the game regardless. This is an interesting take for a Tetris game. The color matching on blocks approach can lead to some satisfying moments, but I would rather play Dr. Mario instead of this hybrid style. And going through all the rounds isn't as fun as something like the original Tetris where the endless nature was more fun, so having Tetris 2 not be endless and needlessly long diminishes that. Although as an NES game, you could do worse. And you could play it with someone for a bit of competitive puzzle fun, and you really don't need to play a lot of the single player to see pretty much everything this game has to offer. However, that was just the NES version, as Tetris 2 did release on other platforms later, like the Game Boy. And while in some ways it is a handheld version of what we just played, there are some differences in new content to warrant playing this as well. So yeah, this is a special multiple version review of They Made a Sequel. As if I didn't have enough things to talk about in this video. Anyway, the Game Boy version released in North America first in December of 1993, with the Japanese and European releases the following year. Toei and Nintendo were still the developer and publisher respectively, although this time Bulletproof Software were part of the licensors to bring this to the Game Boy. As such, compromises were made, mostly for the visuals as the 3 colors now have distinct patterns in order to tell them apart on the monochrome system. But you'll notice that there is some color here, and that's because this is Super Game Boy compatible, or rather later releases of Tetris 2 for the Game Boy were. My copy isn't one, but playing on the Retron 5 did enable colors for it, though not the exact ones for the Super Game Boy and no borders either. But then again, the latter was only enabled by pausing and pressing A apparently. I think on the Retron it defaults to a preset that more closely matches the colors from the cover of the game. Although it is certainly more striking with its ketchup and mustard and pepper palette. But I'll still take this over no colors. But even then, the rest of the visuals are pretty simplistic compared to the NES, which already wasn't all that impressive there, so it's even more bland on the Game Boy. As for the game itself, the normal mode is largely the same from the NES, with the same options and music tracks, pretty much the entire soundtrack is just brought over from the NES, and 80 rounds to go through. Again. And still no passwords or anything for resuming past 30. Hooray. However, the cutscenes after every 10 rounds are different. Here it's a flower guy emerging from the ground and taking a long journey to reach a rainbow, or rather a ketchup and mustard bow in this case, and going into the puddle of water under it to sleep in. And it does play out for the entire 80 rounds and not essentially loop twice like on the NES. It does still just leaves on an end screen, but at least it is something new. And maybe it's because I got more used to Tetris 2 by now, or the Game Boy version is a little more forgiving, or a combination of both, but I didn't have as much trouble getting through this. Granted, I still had to retry a fair amount in later rounds, but it did take less time to complete them. Even if I still say it's probably not really worth it to go through them all unless you really want to see all the flower guy scenes. Besides, that is just the normal game mode, as the Game Boy version does add a completely new puzzle mode. In this, there are 30 stages to clear out with predetermined shapes at your disposal. You have 100 pieces to clear these, so even if you mess up at the start, you can eventually clear them out like a regular Tetris 2 round. But the real challenge comes in doing them with less pieces for a high score. And if you do them in the least amount of pieces possible, you get a perfect and a bullseye next to the round number on the scoreboard. This is where the puzzle mode truly shines as you figure out where pieces need to exactly go to do the combinations as intended, and some are pretty tricky and creative. I did have to look up some of these admittedly, though you can have a manual setting for pressing down for the next piece in order to take your time and think where to place them beforehand if you want to solve these on your own. If anything, this mode is best designed with the Tetris 2 mechanics in mind, and it was actually kind of fun to fully solve these. I even ended up getting all perfects because of that, so this is definitely a welcome addition on the Game Boy. Otherwise, there isn't really anything else new. The multiplayer is largely the same, just limited beyond Game Boy and needing to link up with another person's system and copy, which was the norm for 2 players on that. However, you can still play against the CPU, which is something you couldn't do on the original Game Boy Tetris, but it does show what remaining blocks are left for both of you, and there's a meter to show what their line and ceiling heights are. Still neat that you can do this by yourself in a Game Boy Tetris game. We wouldn't get another CPU battle option on there until Tetris DX for the Game Boy Color, but really it is still the same competitive Tetris 2 regardless, complete with the CPU difficulty being the same. Normally it's still a little too much unless you really are good at this game. So while the Game Boy version is mostly a port from the NES, the inclusion of the puzzle mode does make this an objectively better version in terms of content and a step in the right direction. The only things the NES version has over this is having 2 players on the same screen and having more colorful visuals, which is a given over the Game Boy ones. So while I did have a better time with Tetris 2 on the Game Boy, it wasn't by a whole lot. I still have some frustrations with the normal gameplay loop. However, there is one more version of Tetris 2 that did get released, the Super Nintendo version. that I have box because it wasn't that expensive when I found it. None of the Tetris 2 games are really. So this is the last chance this game has to win me over. And does it? Well, I'll just get into it and you can see for yourself. The Super Nintendo Tetris 2 released in July of 1994 in Japan and North America, with Europe getting it the following year. This time with Bulletproof Software being the Japanese publishers, and Nintendo assisting development along with Tosei on top of publishing the game elsewhere. For the normal game mode, it's 80 rounds, yet again, with only being able to start up to 30 and having to go through all 80 without turning off the system if you want to beat it. Again! But there are some new things for this version. For one, if you clear a round in a quick enough time, you get a time bonus score, and that will get you credits to remove up to 10 blocks for the next round, so that is a good way to encourage clearing rounds quickly. Another change is that it's now every 5 cleared rounds you will get a cutscene, and these primarily revolve around the characters of this game doing silly things with no continuous theme this time, so there is more going on here. However, the rest of the inherent flaws that I find in Tetris 2's main mode are still here and in some ways can be worse. Because in later stages, the problem of not having much time or room to place pieces is still here. And while the time bonuses of removing 10 of them do help, it doesn't make much of a dent with the amount of blocks in the late rounds. And not even the solid line pieces to easily get the 6 color matches are as reliable here. They seem to take longer to show up in this version. Also, for some reason, on certain rounds past 30, if you lose, trying again will put you back a couple of rounds. Why do this now when the other versions didn't? When you add that it's already easy to lose a round almost immediately in a packed board, it's more punishing than challenging if anything that just drags the main mode of Tetris 2 even more than it already did. Well, if I wasn't already using save states at this point, I definitely would be now thanks to that nonsensical design choice.
That's right.
But even with that, it was still a slog to go through all 80 stages just to get a little ending cutscene and congrats screen. So the changes that are here on the SNES didn't help as much as I would want, or just made it worse. Thankfully, the puzzle mode is back and has its share of additions too. Initially, you have up to 30 to choose from like on the Game Boy, but there are more rounds after, up to 100 in fact. Which can seem like a lot, especially when compared to the normal mode's 80, but you do get an easy to remember 3-character password after each stage past 30. Wait a minute, they made a password system for the puzzle mode but not the main game mode? Well, regardless, the puzzle mode is still satisfying to get perfect solutions on, which I did end up getting all of them here as well. So if you're looking for more of that from the Game Boy version, you'll be pleased with what the Super Nintendo one has to offer. Otherwise, the multiplayer is still the same, just with the game characters as CPU opponents and getting a visual overhaul with water levels representing the lowering play fields and fish for win points, making it a creative visual touch. I can't say that for the rest of the game's overall visuals, as it is a considerable upgrade from the 8-bit versions. They're vibrant and detailed well enough with the main mode background, which does change to a different one after 30 rounds, then every 10 rounds after, which can have some amusing animations when tallying scores after completing rounds or pausing the game. And the animated cutscenes are nice too. My only minor complaint I could have is that the puzzle mode only has the one background of what I assume is a beer glass for the board, with a chicken dinner off to the side and some dinosaurs out the window. It just makes me think the T-Rex there is going, "Hey, you can eat that chicken." Not saying it's a bad background, just that it's the only one for the 100 puzzle rounds. Also, with some of these backgrounds, you can tell they were meant for old CRT screens and not HD ones due to how some of the pixel art was done. Like with these posters of a Honolulu boy and Gaio. But other than that, the game looks fine. The same can be said for the music, as it's completely original music for this version and works well enough with its 16-bit jaunty and whimsical takes for Tetris 2. It just has the same issue of having the one track you slick and monotonous after a while, but the rest is still fine. My favorite main game mode track is once again C, only here it's more of an upbeat and catchy tune. I would say this version has the best music given the Super Nintendo upgrade, but it still doesn't hold a candle to the main Tetris themes. And honestly, aside from the better presentation having more puzzle rounds, the Super Nintendo version, while objectively the best version of Tetris 2, didn't completely win me over. Because it boils down to the normal game mode, and it probably didn't help that I forced myself to go through the 80 rounds in all 3 versions, but the SNES tested my patience the most, and the fact that it puts you to lower rounds if you lose makes it even less fun if you're trying to beat it on original hardware, which is really the only official option right now. Because despite these games doing well enough, though exact sales figures aren't quite out there, they have never gotten a re-release. Not even any version of Tetris Flash is playable in the Forever collection, so that and the Tetris 2 counterpart are only passing mentions in the documentary part. But considering none of the versions are that expensive, even with how much retro game prices have gone up in recent years, you can reasonably get these physically if you have the systems for them. So it should come to no surprise that as a sequel to Tetris, these don't really live up to that title, as unfair as that comparison is, but Nintendo did deliberately label these as such outside Japan. So expectations were there, and then you play it and it's like, oh, it plays like this. When more fairly judging this as Tetris Flash, I think it's an okay spin-off with a color-matching twist on the Tetris formula. I'm just not personally a fan of how much the main game mode drags on. Though that's only if you're really compelled to try and complete these. And there is still some fun with the puzzle and multiplayer modes. Plus, I'm willing to admit I'm not very good at these games like I said earlier, which I'm sure those of you that are familiar with Tetris 2 will probably call me out on my skill issue for. I think it's mainly because it plays much more like Dr. Mario than Tetris, which if you are a fan of the former, you could enjoy these games too. But if you're like me and prefer Tetris, this will take a while to adjust to. Although I will commend Tetris 2, or Flash, for doing something unique with a Tetris style game. I guess labeling it as a 2 back in the day wasn't as outlandish when being different truly meant a new game in the series. I mean, look at Zelda and Castlevania 2 compared to their first games. And since then, Tetris hasn't really gotten sequels per se, but rather an evolution through the 40 years of the classic style that practically anyone can enjoy and keep going back to. Few video game series can do that. Tetris 2 may have been a curiosity turned spin-off of some repute, but playing it actually made me appreciate Tetris as a whole even more than I already did. So even if I was okay with these at best, I can always just fall back to the many classics and will still likely keep playing new versions as long as they make them. Okay, wow, I didn't expect to get that deep over Tetris, but I guess that's what happens when you go into weird sequels or spin-offs like this. Though I'm definitely done with playing Tetris 2 anytime soon, let alone 3 versions of it. At this point, I'd rather play any other Tetris thing, like, Word Tris.
Huh?
Okay, no, it's not worth it for the bit. I'm just gonna play Tetris Sphere and vibe out to the music instead. I'll see you all in the next video.